The scorching Texas sun beat down mercilessly as Colonel Jerome Mitchell adjusted his civilian clothes and approached his food truck, Sergeant's Kitchen, parked just outside Fort Braxton's main gate. What should have been another successful lunch service for the soldiers was about to become a lesson in assumptions that would cost several careers and change military protocol forever. Before we dive into this shocking story of prejudice and power, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. Hit that like button and subscribe if you believe respect should be earned through character, not assumptions based on appearance. Now buckle up as we explore how one decorated military commander turned a moment of humiliation into a masterclass in justice. Officer Bradley Hutchins of the Braxton County Sheriff's Department pulled his patrol car up to the food truck with the confidence of someone who had never been challenged in his 15 years of small-town law enforcement. At 38, Bradley had built his reputation on what he called maintaining order, which often meant hassling anyone who didn't fit his narrow definition of belonging in their predominantly white community. The sight of a black man serving food to soldiers outside the military base immediately raised his suspicions. In Bradley's mind, this was exactly the type of situation that required his intervention. He stepped out of his patrol car, his hand instinctively resting on his belt, and approached the truck with the swagger of assumed authority. Jerome was busy preparing orders for a line of soldiers when he noticed the approaching officer. Having spent 25 years in the military, he recognized the type immediately. Every base had its share of local law enforcement who felt entitled to flex their authority, especially when they thought nobody important was watching. "Hey there, boy," Bradley called out, his tone dripping with condescension. "You got permits for this operation?" Jerome paused in his preparation, slowly turning to face the officer. The use of boy hung in the air like a slap, its racist implications clear to everyone within earshot. Several soldiers in line shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the disrespect but unsure how to intervene. "Good afternoon, officer," Jerome replied with measured calm, his military bearing evident despite his civilian attire. "I'm Jerome Mitchell, owner of Sergeant's Kitchen. Yes, I have all the required permits." Bradley looked him up and down dismissively. "Jerome, huh? Well, Jerome, I'm gonna need to see those permits right now. And while you're at it, I want to know what you're really doing here. This is a military installation, not some street corner in the hood." The racist undertone was unmistakable. Jerome felt the familiar burn of discrimination, the same feeling he'd battled throughout his military career whenever small-minded people saw his skin color before his rank or accomplishments. But this time was different. This time, he had nothing to prove to anyone. Private Connor Walsh, a young soldier who had been ordering his usual Tuesday special, stepped forward. "Officer, sir, Mr. Mitchell has been serving here for months. The base commander personally approved his permits." Bradley turned his glare on the young private. "Did I ask you, soldier boy? Mind your own business before you find yourself in real trouble." Jerome placed a calming hand on Connor's shoulder. "It's all right, son. Let me handle this." He reached into the truck and retrieved a folder containing his permits, business license, and health department certifications. "Here are all my documents, officer. Everything is in order." Bradley snatched the folder with unnecessary force, making a show of examining each document with exaggerated scrutiny. "These look fake to me," he announced loudly, clearly enjoying the attention from the growing crowd of soldiers. "How do I know you didn't just print these up this morning?" Several soldiers exchanged glances, their discomfort growing. Staff Sergeant Malik Johnson, a veteran who had served under Jerome in Afghanistan, pushed through the crowd. He knew exactly who Jerome was, but also understood that revealing his identity prematurely might rob his former commander of the opportunity to handle the situation his own way. These are legitimate documents issued by Braxton County. Jerome stated firmly, "If you have questions about their authenticity, I suggest you call the issuing office." "I suggest you watch your tone with me, boy," Bradley snapped back. "Matter of fact, I think you need to pack up this little operation and move along. This area is for legitimate businesses, not food stamp entrepreneurs." The insult hit its mark, and Jerome felt his jaw tighten. But years of military discipline had taught him when to engage and when to let his opponent reveal their true character. The gathering crowd was seeing exactly who Bradley Hutchins really was. "Food stamp entrepreneurs," Jerome repeated quietly. "Is that what you think of black business owners, officer?" Bradley realized he'd said the quiet part loud, but doubled down rather than retreat. "I think troublemakers come in all colors, but they tend to show up where they don't belong. And right now, you don't belong here." The crowd had grown significantly, with soldiers pulling out their phones to record the interaction. Word was spreading quickly through the base's informal communication network, and several officers had already been notified about the situation developing at the main gate. "Officer Hutchins," Jerome read from the name tag, "I'm going to ask you once more to review my permits properly. You'll find everything is in complete compliance with local and federal regulations." "I don't care if you have permits signed by the president himself," Bradley shot back. "This is my jurisdiction, and I'm telling you to move along. Pack up your little ghetto kitchen and find somewhere else to hustle." The word ghetto sparked angry murmurs from the soldiers. These men and women had been enjoying Jerome's food for months, had come to appreciate not just his cooking, but his respectful demeanor and genuine care for their welfare. Watching him be degraded by a local officer was stirring something dangerous in the crowd. Master Sergeant Isaiah Reynolds, the base's senior enlisted advisor, had just arrived after receiving word about the incident. He immediately recognized Jerome, but chose to observe how the situation would unfold. Like Malik, he understood that their former commander might want to handle this confrontation on his own terms. "I'm not moving anywhere, officer," Jerome stated, with quiet authority. "I have every legal right to operate my business here. If you have legitimate concerns about my permits or operations, follow proper procedure and file a complaint with the appropriate agencies." Bradley's face reddened with frustration. In his experience, intimidation usually worked quickly, especially against minorities who feared police interaction. But Jerome's calm defiance was undermining his authority in front of dozens of witnesses. "All right, that's it," Bradley announced, reaching for his handcuffs. "You're under arrest for trespassing, operating without proper permits, and disorderly conduct." "On what grounds?" Jerome asked, not moving from his position. "On the grounds that I'm a police officer and you're some punk with a food truck thinking he can smart-mouth me," Bradley replied, abandoning any pretense of professionalism. The crowd of soldiers grew restless. Several senior non-commissioned officers were now present, all recognizing Jerome, but waiting to see how he wanted to play the situation. The level of disrespect being shown to their former commander was testing their discipline. Jerome looked around at the faces surrounding him, seeing the anger and frustration of soldiers who wanted to intervene but were caught between respect for civilian authority and loyalty to someone they deeply respected. He made a decision that would change everything. "Officer Hutchins," Jerome said, his voice carrying the unmistakable tone of command that had once led thousands of soldiers, "before you make what might be a career-ending mistake, I suggest you reconsider your approach." Something in Jerome's tone made Bradley pause. For the first time, he seemed to recognize that this wasn't just another street vendor he could bully with impunity. But his pride and prejudice had pushed him too far to back down gracefully. "Are you threatening me?" Bradley demanded, his hand moving to his weapon. Not at all, Jerome replied calmly. I'm offering you an opportunity to handle this situation professionally before it escalates beyond your control. Sergeant First Class Denzel Washington, Jerome's former aide-de-camp, couldn't remain silent any longer. Officer, sir, you might want to reconsider your actions here. Another soldier. Boy wants to play hero, Bradley scoffed. All of you back off, or I'll call for backup, and we can sort this out at the station. Jerome raised his hand slightly, a gesture that immediately quieted the soldiers. 25 years of command presence didn't disappear just because he'd changed into civilian clothes. Gentlemen, stand down, Jerome ordered quietly, and every soldier immediately complied. The instant obedience should have been Bradley's first clue that this was no ordinary food truck operator. Look at that, Bradley laughed mockingly. The ghetto chef thinks he can give orders to United States soldiers. This is rich. Major Austin Crawford, the base's deputy commander, had just arrived and was briefing himself on the situation. He immediately recognized Jerome and felt his blood pressure rising as he watched the disrespectful treatment of his commanding officer. But he too understood the value of letting the situation play out. Officer, I'm going to give you one final opportunity to verify my permits through proper channels and conduct yourself professionally, Jerome offered, his patience wearing thin but his composure intact. I've had enough of your mouth, Bradley declared, stepping forward aggressively. Put your hands behind your back. You're coming with me. Jerome didn't move. I don't think so. The simple refusal sent Bradley over the edge. Resisting arrest, he shouted, as if announcing the charge would somehow legitimize his actions. All you soldiers witness this punk resisting lawful arrest. But the soldiers weren't seeing resistance. They were seeing their former commander being harassed and disrespected by a prejudiced officer who had no idea who he was dealing with. The tension in the air was becoming dangerous. Jerome looked at his watch, then at the growing crowd of soldiers and the few civilians who had stopped to witness the confrontation. He'd given Bradley every opportunity to handle the situation professionally. Now it was time to end the charade. Officer Hutchins, Jerome said, pulling out his cell phone, since you seem unwilling to verify my credentials through proper channels, perhaps you'd like to speak with someone who can confirm my authority to operate here. I don't care if you call your mama, Bradley sneered. You're under arrest. Jerome speed-dialed a number and put the phone on speaker. After 2 rings, a crisp voice answered. General Morrison's office, how may I help you? This is Colonel Mitchell. I need to speak with the general immediately regarding a situation at Fort Braxton's main gate. Bradley's confident smirk faltered slightly. Colonel? He looked more closely at Jerome, noticing for the first time the military bearing, the command presence, the way every soldier in the area was watching with barely contained anger. Jerome, came General Morrison's voice through the phone. What's the situation? Sir, I'm being harassed by a local officer who refuses to accept my legitimate permits and is attempting to arrest me for operating my food truck. He's made several racist comments and threatened to arrest soldiers who attempted to vouch for me. The phone went silent for a moment, then put the officer on the phone. Bradley stared at the phone like it might explode. Around him, the pieces were starting to fall into place. The respectful attention of the soldiers, the command presence, the direct line to a general. This wasn't just any food truck operator. Officer, Jerome said, extending the phone, General Morrison would like to speak with you. Bradley's hand trembled slightly as he took the phone. This is Officer Hutchins, Braxton County Sheriff's Department. Officer Hutchins, this is General Morrison, commanding officer of Fort Braxton. The man you're harassing is Colonel Jerome Mitchell, my Garrison Commander and a decorated veteran of 25 years. He has my personal authorization to operate his business at that location. Now, I suggest you apologize immediately and remove yourself from the situation before this becomes an incident that ends your career." The phone felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds in Bradley's hand. Around him, the soldiers were no longer just watching with interest. They were watching with the cold attention of people who had just witnessed their commanding officer being publicly humiliated by a racist who had no idea what he'd stepped into. Bradley looked at Jerome with new eyes, seeing not a random black food truck operator, but a full colonel in the United States Army, a man who outranked most people on the base and commanded the respect of every soldier present. The weight of his mistake crashed down on him like a collapsing building. I didn't know," Bradley stammered, trying to hand the phone back. "No," Jerome said quietly, not taking the phone. "Finish your conversation with the general." This was the moment when Bradley Hutchins realized that his 15-year career in law enforcement was about to come to an abrupt and humiliating end. The crowd of witnesses, the recorded evidence, the direct involvement of a military general, all of it combined to create a perfect storm of accountability that he couldn't escape. What would you do if you witnessed this kind of discrimination? Comment number 1 if you believe everyone deserves respect regardless of their profession or appearance. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more stories that expose the reality of prejudice and the power of justice. To understand the full impact of what happened at Fort Braxton's main gate, we need to explore the remarkable journey that brought Colonel Jerome Mitchell from the housing projects of Detroit to the highest levels of military command, and why his quiet strength in the face of discrimination represented something much larger than one man's dignity. Jerome Mitchell was born in 1975 in the Brewster Douglas housing projects of Detroit, Michigan, the same complex that had once housed Diana Ross and other Motown legends. But by the time Jerome arrived, the projects had become synonymous with poverty, violence, and despair. His mother, Keisha Mitchell, worked 3 jobs to support Jerome and his 2 younger sisters, Aaliyah and Simone. Every morning before dawn, Keisha would leave their small apartment to begin her shift at the automotive parts factory. By afternoon, she'd transition to her job as a hospital cleaner, and most evenings found her stocking shelves at the neighborhood grocery store. Despite her exhaustion, she never missed helping Jerome with his homework or attending his school events. "Education is your weapon," she would tell him as they sat at their small kitchen table, textbooks spread between them. "They can take everything else from you, but they can never take what's in your head." The local schools Jerome attended were underfunded and overcrowded. Textbooks were outdated, supplies were scarce, and many teachers had given up hope of making a real difference. Gang violence was a daily reality, with shootings and drug deals occurring within sight of the school playground. Most of Jerome's classmates expected to either join the military or the streets, seeing no other paths to escape their circumstances. But Jerome was different. Even as a young boy, he displayed natural leadership qualities and an unwavering sense of justice. When older kids bullied younger students, Jerome intervened. When classmates struggled with schoolwork, he helped them study. His teachers recognized something special in the quiet boy who read voraciously and always stood up for others. Mr. Terrence Adams, Jerome's 8th grade history teacher, became his mentor and advocate. A former Marine who had returned to teaching after his military service, Mr. Adams saw potential in Jerome that extended far beyond the projects. "Son," Mr. Adams told him one afternoon, "you have the mind of a scholar and the heart of a leader. The military could give you structure, education, and opportunities that might not exist otherwise." At 17, Jerome stood 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders and an intensity that commanded attention. But it wasn't his physical presence that impressed people. It was his character. While his peers were cutting classes or getting into trouble, Jerome was reading military history and dreaming of a future beyond the projects. The decision to enlist came after his junior year, when a drive-by shooting claimed the life of his best friend, Rashad Johnson. Standing at Rashad's funeral, watching his friend's mother collapse in grief, Jerome made a promise to himself that he would not become another casualty of street violence. "I'm joining the Army," he told his mother the day after the funeral. Keisha had expected this moment, but still felt her heart break. "Baby, you're too young. You haven't even finished high school." "I can finish through the military," Jerome replied. "Mama, if I stay here, I'm gonna end up like Rashad or worse. I need to get out while I still can." She knew he was right. The streets had already claimed too many bright young men from their neighborhood. If the military could give her son a chance at a better life, she would support his decision. Basic training at Fort Benning, Georgia, was Jerome's first experience with institutional racism in the military. Several drill sergeants made no attempt to hide their prejudice, singling out black recruits for extra punishment and making racist comments they thought were clever. But Jerome had learned to channel anger into determination, using discrimination as fuel for his ambition, rather than letting it break his spirit. "Mitchell," Drill Sergeant Connor McKinnon would shout during formation, "you think you're special, boy. You think coming from the projects makes you tough?" "No, Drill Sergeant." Jerome would respond with perfect military bearing. "I think coming from the projects makes me hungry, Drill Sergeant." His response always caught McKinnon off guard. Instead of the anger or resentment the drill sergeant expected, Jerome displayed a quiet confidence that frustrated his tormentors. He couldn't be broken because he'd already survived worse than anything the military could throw at him. Jerome excelled in every aspect of basic training. He scored the highest on physical fitness tests, demonstrated exceptional marksmanship, and showed natural leadership ability that impressed even the most skeptical instructors. When graduation day arrived, he was selected as the honor graduate of his class. But the real test came during his first deployment to Bosnia in 1995. As a young private, Jerome found himself in a unit where racial tensions ran high. Several white soldiers from southern states made no secret of their belief that black soldiers were inferior, dangerous, or untrustworthy. The situation came to a head during a patrol, when Private Austin Walsh, a soldier from Alabama, refused to follow Jerome's instructions during a tactical movement. "I ain't taking orders from no project boy," Walsh declared in front of the entire squad. Staff Sergeant Logan Cooper, the squad leader, faced a choice. He could maintain discipline by enforcing Jerome's authority, or he could quietly reassign responsibilities to avoid confrontation. What he chose to do next would define Jerome's early military experience. "Walsh," Sergeant Cooper said firmly, "Private Mitchell is your team leader. You will follow his instructions without question, or you will face disciplinary action. Is that understood?" "But Sergeant," Walsh began, "is that understood, Private Walsh?" "Yes, Sergeant." Cooper's decision to support Jerome, despite racial pressures, taught him a valuable lesson about leadership. True leaders didn't just give orders, they created environments where everyone could succeed, regardless of background or prejudice. Jerome's performance during the Bosnia deployment earned him rapid promotion to specialist and recognition as one of the most promising young soldiers in his unit. His combination of technical competence, physical courage, and moral integrity set him apart from his peers. But it was during his second deployment to Kosovo in 1999 that Jerome truly proved his leadership potential. Now a sergeant, he was responsible for a diverse squad that included soldiers from various racial and ethnic backgrounds. When ethnic violence erupted in their sector, Jerome's unit was tasked with protecting a group of Albanian refugees from Serbian paramilitaries. During one particularly intense firefight, Jerome's squad was pinned down by sniper fire while escorting a convoy of refugee families to safety. 2 of his soldiers were wounded, ammunition was running low, and Serbian forces were advancing on their position. "Sergeant Mitchell," came the voice of Lieutenant Preston Hayes over the radio. "You need to withdraw immediately. We can't risk the entire squad for a refugee convoy." Jerome looked at the terrified faces of the families they were protecting. Children huddled against their mothers, elderly people struggled to keep up with the evacuation, and everyone looked to him for safety. The easy choice was to follow orders and retreat. The right choice was something else entirely. "Lieutenant, I understand your orders, but we're not leaving these people," Jerome replied into his radio. "My squad will hold this position until the convoy is clear." "Sergeant, that's a direct order to withdraw." "With respect, sir, I'm interpreting my mission as protecting innocent civilians. We'll withdraw when they're safe." For the next 3 hours, Jerome's squad fought off superior numbers while shepherding refugees to safety. When reinforcements finally arrived, they found Jerome's position surrounded by empty ammunition cases and evidence of the fierce battle that had taken place. But every refugee had made it to safety, and not a single American soldier had been lost. The action earned Jerome the Bronze Star with valor and recognition throughout the division. More importantly, it established his reputation as a leader who would never abandon people under his protection, regardless of the personal cost. After Kosovo, Jerome was selected for Officer Candidate School. The transition from enlisted soldier to officer brought new challenges, particularly in an environment where many of his fellow candidates came from privileged backgrounds and had never questioned their place in the world. "Mitchell," said candidate Bradley Foster during a late-night study session, "how do you do it? How do you stay so calm when everyone's trying to prove you don't belong here?" Jerome looked up from his military law textbook. "What makes you think I don't belong here? Come on, man. We all know you're one of maybe 3 black guys in the whole class. Half these instructors look at you like you're an experiment that might fail." "Maybe," Jerome replied, "but I'm not here to make them comfortable. I'm here to become the best officer I can be. Their comfort level is their problem, not mine." His approach paid off. Jerome graduated second in his OCS class and was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the infantry. His first assignment as an officer was with the 82nd Airborne Division, where he would spend the next 6 years learning the complexities of military leadership at every level. The real test of Jerome's character came during his deployment to Afghanistan in 2003. As a captain commanding a company of paratroopers, he was responsible for 150 soldiers operating in one of the most dangerous provinces in the country. His unit included soldiers from every conceivable background: urban and rural, black and white, college graduates and high school dropouts. Creating unity among such a diverse group while operating in a combat environment required every leadership skill Jerome had developed. But he approached the challenge with the same quiet confidence that had carried him through every previous obstacle. "Gentlemen," he told his platoon leaders during their first briefing, "we are not black soldiers or white soldiers or Latino soldiers. We are American soldiers and we are paratroopers. That's our identity. That's what unites us. Anyone who has a problem with that can request a transfer right now." No one requested a transfer. During their 15-month deployment, Jerome's company conducted hundreds of combat operations, built schools and medical clinics, and earned the respect of both Afghan civilians and enemy fighters. His soldiers never questioned his courage, competence, or commitment to their welfare. The defining moment came during a complex operation to clear a Taliban stronghold from a mountain village. Intelligence reports indicated heavy resistance, and several previous attempts by other units had failed with significant casualties. Jerome developed a plan that combined conventional tactics with unconventional diplomacy. Rather than simply attacking the village, he first met with local elders to explain the American mission and negotiate safe passage for civilians. Captain Major Garrett Stevens, his battalion commander, said during the planning session, "The elders might be working with the Taliban. This diplomacy angle could get your people killed. Sir, these people have been caught between warring factions for decades. If we show them respect and give them options, they might surprise us." Jerome's approach worked perfectly. The village elders provided intelligence about Taliban positions and helped evacuate civilians before the operation began. When the assault commenced, Jerome's company faced minimal resistance because the Taliban had lost their local support network. The operation was completed with no American casualties and minimal civilian impact. More importantly, it demonstrated Jerome's ability to think beyond conventional military tactics and find solutions that protected both his soldiers and innocent civilians. His success in Afghanistan earned Jerome promotion to major and selection for advanced military education at the Command and General Staff College. But even as his career advanced, he never forgot the lessons learned during his journey from the Detroit projects to military command. "Leadership isn't about position or rank," he would tell young officers under his command. "It's about character and the willingness to do what's right, even when it's difficult." By 2010, Jerome had been promoted to lieutenant colonel and was commanding a battalion of over 800 soldiers. His reputation for fairness, competence, and integrity had spread throughout the Army, and he was frequently called upon to handle sensitive situations that required both tactical skill and diplomatic finesse. The promotion to full colonel came in 2015, along with assignment as Garrison Commander of Fort Braxton. At 40 years old, Jerome Mitchell had achieved something that would have seemed impossible to the young boy growing up in the Detroit projects: command of an entire military installation with responsibility for thousands of soldiers and their families. But success hadn't changed his fundamental character. He still remembered what it felt like to be underestimated, discriminated against, and counted out before being given a chance to prove himself. Those experiences had shaped his leadership philosophy and his commitment to ensuring that every soldier under his command was treated with dignity and respect. Which brings us back to that sweltering Tuesday afternoon at Fort Braxton's main gate, where Colonel Jerome Mitchell stood calmly in civilian clothes, while Officer Bradley Hutchins made the biggest mistake of his career. The food truck business hadn't been about money or fame. It had been about staying connected to the soldiers he commanded, understanding their daily challenges, and providing them with something as simple as a good meal prepared with care and respect. But to Officer Hutchins, Jerome was just another black man who needed to be put in his place. What Bradley didn't understand was that Jerome Mitchell had spent 25 years earning his place through excellence, sacrifice, and unwavering integrity. He wasn't intimidated by small-town racism because he'd overcome much worse on his journey to command. And now, with his phone call to General Morrison, Bradley was about to discover exactly who he'd chosen to confront. The transformation from Project Kid to military commander hadn't been easy, but it had prepared Jerome for exactly this moment. Everything he'd learned about leadership, justice, and the power of quiet dignity was about to be put to the ultimate test. The silence that followed General Morrison's words through the speaker phone was deafening. Officer Bradley Hutchins stood frozen, the device trembling in his hand as the full weight of his mistake began to register. Around him, dozens of soldiers watched with a mixture of satisfaction and barely contained anger as their commanding officer's true identity was revealed. Colonel Jerome Mitchell stood with the same calm dignity he'd maintained throughout the encounter, but now everyone understood why the soldiers had responded to him with such immediate respect. This wasn't just any black business owner being harassed by a prejudiced cop. This was their commander, a decorated veteran who had earned his position through 25 years of exemplary service. "Officer Hutchins," General Morrison's voice continued through the phone. "Are you still there?" "Yes, sir," Bradley managed to croak, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. "Let me be absolutely clear about the situation you've created. Colonel Mitchell is not just any officer. He's one of the finest commanders in the United States Army, a Bronze Star recipient, and a man who has served this country with distinction in multiple combat deployments. The fact that you've subjected him to racist harassment reflects not just on you personally, but on every law enforcement agency in this region." Major Austin Crawford stepped forward from the crowd, his expression stern. "General, this is Major Crawford. I witnessed the entire incident and can confirm that Officer Hutchins made multiple racist statements and threatened to arrest Colonel Mitchell without cause." The murmur that rippled through the crowd carried an ominous tone. These soldiers had just watched their respected commander be called boy and threatened with arrest by a local officer who had no idea of Jerome's rank or accomplishments. Sergeant First Class Denzel Washington, who had served as Jerome's aide-de-camp in Afghanistan, pulled out his phone and began reviewing the video he'd recorded. "Sir, I have everything documented. The racial slurs, the threats, the complete disregard for proper procedure." Jerome finally took the phone back from Bradley's trembling hand. "General, I believe Officer Hutchins understands his mistake now. The question is what happens next." "Colonel, what are your recommendations?" Jerome looked at Bradley, who was sweating profusely despite the afternoon heat. The officer's earlier arrogance had been replaced by the terrified expression of someone watching their career implode in real time. "Sir, I believe this incident requires a comprehensive review of how local law enforcement interacts with military personnel and authorized contractors. This wasn't just poor judgment, it was systemic racism that could have escalated into something much worse if not for the restraint shown by my soldiers." Staff Sergeant Malik Johnson stepped closer to the conversation. As someone who had served under Jerome in multiple deployments, he felt a personal obligation to ensure justice was served. "General Morrison, sir, I've served with Colonel Mitchell for over 8 years. He's saved more American lives than this officer will ever know. The disrespect shown here is unacceptable." "Agreed, Sergeant Johnson," came the general's voice. "Officer Hutchins, you will report to my office at 0800 hours tomorrow morning, along with your supervisor and the county sheriff. We're going to have a very serious discussion about the relationship between local law enforcement and this installation." Bradley found his voice, though it was much smaller than before. "General, sir, I didn't know who he was. If I had realized he was an officer—" "Stop right there," Jerome interrupted, his command voice cutting through Bradley's excuse. "The issue isn't that you didn't recognize my rank, Officer Hutchins. The issue is that you treated me with disrespect and racism because you saw a black man and assumed I didn't belong here. My rank doesn't make racism acceptable or unacceptable. My humanity should have been enough." The power of Jerome's words hit everyone present. This wasn't about military protocol or chain of command. This was about basic human dignity and the assumption that people deserved respect regardless of their appearance or presumed social status. Master Sergeant Isaiah Reynolds, the senior enlisted advisor who had been quietly observing, stepped forward. "Colonel, sir, request permission to speak freely." "Granted, Master Sergeant." Sir, every soldier here has witnessed something that goes beyond disrespect to a superior officer. We've seen the kind of treatment that black service members and their families face in this community every day. This incident is an opportunity to address a much larger problem. Jerome nodded thoughtfully. Isaiah was right. This wasn't an isolated incident, but a symptom of deeper issues that affected military families throughout the region. General Morrison's voice came through the phone again. Colonel Mitchell, I'm calling an immediate meeting with Sheriff Caleb Morrison, the county commissioners, and the base command staff. This incident will be thoroughly investigated, and there will be consequences, but I want to know how you want to proceed personally. Jerome considered his options. He could accept an apology, file a complaint through official channels, or use this moment to create meaningful change. His decision would impact not just his own situation, but potentially improve conditions for every minority service member and their families in the area. General, I want to turn this into a teaching moment. Officer Hutchins made a mistake that could have cost him his career and damaged police-military relations in this community. Instead of just punishing him, I'd like to create a program that ensures this never happens again. The crowd of soldiers exchanged surprised looks, even after being subjected to blatant racism and public humiliation. Their commander was thinking about constructive solutions rather than revenge. Bradley looked at Jerome with a mixture of confusion and growing respect. Sir, I don't understand. Why would you want to help me after what I did? Because, Officer Hutchins, leadership isn't about getting revenge when someone wrongs you. It's about creating systems that prevent similar wrongs from happening to others. You humiliated me today, but you also revealed a problem that affects many people in this community. Private Connor Walsh, the young soldier who had first tried to defend Jerome, spoke up. Colonel, sir, my girlfriend is black and she's been stopped 3 times by local police just for visiting me on base. She's never gotten a ticket, but they always find reasons to delay her and make her feel unwelcome. That's exactly what I'm talking about, Jerome replied. This isn't just about one officer's prejudice. It's about a pattern of behavior that affects military families and undermines our relationship with the civilian community. Sheriff Deputy Trevor Hayes, Bradley's supervisor, had just arrived on scene after receiving emergency calls about the situation. He immediately recognized the severity of what had occurred and approached with appropriate deference. Colonel Mitchell, I'm Deputy Sheriff Hayes, Officer Hutchins's supervisor. I want to personally apologize for this incident and assure you that it will be thoroughly investigated. Jerome shook the deputy's hand. Deputy Hayes, I appreciate your response, but investigations aren't enough. We need systemic changes that prevent this from happening again. Absolutely, sir. What would you recommend? Before Jerome could answer, a black sedan with government plates pulled up to the scene. Out stepped General Morrison himself, having made the 20-minute drive from his office to personally address the situation. His presence immediately elevated the seriousness of the incident. Colonel Mitchell, General Morrison said as he approached, I felt this situation required my personal attention. Jerome came to attention and saluted. General Morrison, thank you for your support, sir. At ease, Colonel. Now I want to hear exactly what happened here, and I want to understand what we're going to do to make sure it never happens again. For the next 20 minutes, Jerome recounted the entire incident while soldiers provided additional details and showed their recorded videos. General Morrison listened with growing anger, his jaw tightening with each racist comment that was described or played back from the recordings. Officer Hutchins, General Morrison said when the briefing was complete, in 30 years of military service, I have rarely seen such blatant disrespect shown to one of my commanders. You didn't just insult Colonel Mitchell, You insulted every soldier on this base and the uniform they wear." Bradley had gone from confident authority figure to trembling subordinate in the span of an hour. "General, sir, I sincerely apologize. I had no idea." "You had no idea because you made assumptions based on race." The general cut him off. "That's not ignorance, Officer Hutchins. That's racism, plain and simple." Deputy Hayes stepped forward nervously. "General Morrison, sir, I want to assure you that Officer Hutchins will face appropriate disciplinary action. This behavior doesn't represent the values of our department." "Doesn't it?" Major Crawford interjected. "Because according to the soldiers and family members I've spoken with, this type of harassment happens regularly. Officer Hutchins isn't an aberration. He's part of a pattern." The accusation hung heavy in the air. Several soldiers nodded in agreement, and a few began sharing their own experiences with local law enforcement harassment. "My wife was pulled over 5 times in 2 months, said Sergeant First Class Damon Brooks. "Never got a ticket, but they always found reasons to search her car and question why she was in the area. "My teenage son was stopped while jogging on base housing," added Staff Sergeant Keisha Williams. "They said he matched the description of a suspect, but never explained what crime had been committed." The stories continued, painting a picture of systematic harassment that had been largely ignored by both civilian and military leadership. Jerome listened to each account, his expression growing more determined with every tale of discrimination. General Morrison turned to Deputy Hayes. "It sounds like we need to have a much broader conversation about police-military relations in this community." "Yes, sir," Hayes agreed quickly. "We're committed to addressing these issues." "Good, because here's what's going to happen," General Morrison announced. "First, Officer Hutchins will be suspended pending a full investigation. Second, we're going to establish a joint civilian-military review board to address complaints about police interactions with military families. Third, we're implementing mandatory cultural sensitivity and de-escalation training for all local law enforcement who might interact with base personnel." Bradley's face went pale. "Sir, suspended. I have a family to support. This was just a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding?" Jerome stepped forward, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to command. "Officer Hutchins, you called me boy multiple times. You referred to my business as a ghetto kitchen and suggested I was a food stamp entrepreneur. You threatened to arrest soldiers for vouching for my character. Which part of that was a misunderstanding?" The crowd of soldiers murmured their agreement. They had all witnessed the systematic disrespect, and many had recorded it for posterity. "Colonel Mitchell is being generous in his response to your behavior," General Morrison added. "If it were up to me, you'd be facing federal civil rights charges. The fact that you're not is a testament to his character, not yours." Sheriff Caleb Morrison had just arrived, having received urgent calls about one of his officers creating an international incident at the military base. A political realist who understood the economic importance of Fort Braxton to the local community, he immediately grasped the severity of the situation. "General Morrison, Colonel Mitchell," the sheriff said as he approached, "I am deeply sorry about this incident. Officer Hutchins will face the full consequences of his actions." "Sheriff Morrison," Jerome replied with military courtesy, "I appreciate your response, but I'm more interested in preventing future incidents than punishing past ones." "What do you have in mind, Colonel?" Jerome looked around at the assembled soldiers, many of whom had shared their own experiences with discrimination. This was bigger than one racist cop or even one problematic department. This was about creating an environment where military families could live and work without fear of harassment based on their race. "I propose we create a comprehensive community relations program," Jerome announced. Local law enforcement will receive training on military culture and diversity issues. We'll establish clear protocols for interactions between police and military personnel. And we'll create an oversight committee with representatives from both communities to address complaints and monitor progress. General Morrison nodded approvingly. Excellent proposal, Colonel. Sheriff Morrison, I trust you'll cooperate fully with this initiative. Absolutely, General. We want to be good neighbors to the base community. The crowd began to disperse as the immediate crisis was resolved, but the impact of what had occurred was still reverberating. Videos of the incident were already circulating on social media, and news crews were setting up outside the base gates. Jerome returned to his food truck, where several soldiers were still waiting for their orders despite the extended delay. As he resumed preparing food, the normalcy of the routine provided a stark contrast to the extraordinary events that had just unfolded. "Colonel," said Private Connor Walsh as he accepted his lunch, "I just want you to know that what you did today was inspiring. You could have destroyed that guy, but you chose to make things better instead." "That's what leaders do, son," Jerome replied with a slight smile. "We make things better, not worse." As the afternoon wore on, word of the incident spread throughout the base and into the surrounding community. The contrast between Bradley's racist assumptions and Jerome's measured response became a topic of intense discussion in barracks, family housing areas, and civilian establishments throughout the region. By evening, the story had been picked up by national news outlets. The image of a decorated military commander calmly maintaining his dignity while being harassed by a prejudiced officer resonated with audiences across the country. But for Jerome, the real victory wasn't the media attention or even the policy changes that would follow. It was the message sent to every soldier on his base that their commander would stand up for what was right, even when facing personal humiliation. That night, as Jerome reviewed the day's events in his office, he reflected on the journey that had brought him from the Detroit projects to this moment. Every challenge he'd faced, every instance of discrimination he'd overcome, had prepared him for this test of character and leadership. The phone call from General Morrison came at 2100 hours. "Jerome, I wanted to check in with you personally. How are you holding up after today's events?" "I'm fine, sir, more concerned about the broader implications than the personal aspects." "That's exactly why you're the right person to lead the reform efforts we discussed. The Secretary of Defense's office has already been briefed on the incident. They want to use Fort Braxton as a model for improving civilian-military relations nationwide." Jerome paused, considering the implications. What had started as a local incident was becoming a catalyst for systemic change across the entire military. "Sir, I'm honored by the confidence, but I want to make sure we focus on substance over publicity. Real change takes time and sustained effort." "Agreed. But Jerome, what you demonstrated today was exactly the kind of leadership this situation demanded. You turned a moment of personal humiliation into an opportunity for meaningful progress." After the call ended, Jerome walked through the base housing area where families were settling in for the evening. Children played in yards while their parents prepared dinner and helped with homework. This was what he was fighting for: the right of these families to live without fear of harassment or discrimination. The food truck incident had ended, but its impact was just beginning. Officer Bradley Hutchins would face consequences for his actions, but more importantly, systems would be put in place to prevent similar incidents from occurring. Jerome's response had demonstrated something powerful, that true strength wasn't about overpowering your opponents, but about transforming opposition into opportunity for positive change. His quiet dignity in the face of racism had accomplished more than any angry confrontation could have achieved. The morning after the confrontation at Fort Braxton's main gate, Jerome Mitchell woke before dawn, as was his custom developed over 25 years of military service. But this morning was different. His phone showed dozens of missed calls from media outlets, fellow officers, and military leadership from across the country. The incident had become national news overnight. The first call Jerome returned was to his mother in Detroit. Keisha Mitchell, now in her 70s but still sharp as ever, had seen the news coverage and wanted to check on her son. "Baby, I saw what happened on the television," she said, her voice carrying the mixture of pride and concern that only a mother can convey. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine, Mama, just dealing with the aftermath." "You handled yourself with dignity, just like I taught you, but I'm proud of something else, too." "What's that?" "You didn't let that man's ignorance make you forget who you are. You stayed Jerome Mitchell, the boy I raised, not the angry man he wanted you to become." Her words reminded Jerome why his response had been so important. It wasn't just about military protocol or public relations. It was about maintaining his humanity in the face of dehumanizing treatment. By 0800 hours, Jerome was in his office at Fort Braxton, where his aide, Captain Madison Foster, had prepared a briefing on the overnight developments. The story had been covered by every major news network, shared millions of times on social media, and generated thousands of comments from military families sharing similar experiences. "Sir," Captain Foster reported, "the Pentagon has received over 200 calls from service members and their families, reporting incidents of discriminatory treatment by local law enforcement near military installations across the country." Jerome reviewed the reports, noting patterns that extended far beyond Braxton County. The problem was systemic, affecting military communities nationwide. General Morrison arrived at 0830 for their scheduled meeting, accompanied by Colonel Austin Hayes from the Pentagon's Equal Opportunity Office and Dr. Simone Reynolds, a civilian expert on police-community relations. "Jerome," General Morrison began, "what happened yesterday has opened a much larger conversation about how we protect our military families from discrimination in civilian communities." Dr. Reynolds spread out data on the conference table. "Colonel Mitchell, our preliminary research suggests that military families of color report harassment by local law enforcement at rates 3 times higher than their white counterparts. Your incident yesterday has given us an opportunity to address something that's been largely ignored." Jerome studied the statistics. "Dr. Reynolds, what's the typical response when these incidents are reported?" "Usually nothing meaningful," she replied frankly. "Individual complaints get lost in bureaucracy, and there's rarely enough pressure to force systemic changes. But your case is different because of the visibility and the way you've chosen to respond." Colonel Hayes leaned forward. "Jerome, the Secretary of Defense wants to implement the Braxton model nationwide, comprehensive police-military relations training, joint oversight committees, and clear protocols for addressing discrimination complaints." The magnitude of what was being proposed struck Jerome immediately. What had started as one racist cop's bad day was becoming a catalyst for reforming how military and civilian communities interacted across the entire United States. "Sir, I'm honored by the confidence, but we need to make sure we're addressing root causes, not just symptoms. Training programs are meaningless if there are no consequences for violating them." "Agreed," General Morrison replied. "That's why we're also implementing accountability measures. Local law enforcement agencies that want to maintain contracts with military installations will have to meet strict anti-discrimination standards." As the meeting progressed, Jerome's phone continued buzzing with updates from his communications officer. The story was spreading internationally, with military newspapers in allied countries covering the incident and America's response to it. At noon, Jerome held his first press conference, standing behind a podium in the base's media center. Reporters from across the country had descended on Fort Braxton, turning the small Texas town into the center of a national conversation about race, respect, and reform. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jerome began, his command presence evident even in civilian clothes, "yesterday's incident was unfortunate, but it's provided us with an opportunity to address issues that have affected military families for too long." The first question came from a CNN correspondent. "Colonel Mitchell, how did it feel to be treated with such disrespect after 25 years of military service?" "Ma'am, the disrespect wasn't about my military service. It was about my race. Officer Hutchins didn't know I was a colonel when he called me boy and threatened to arrest me. His behavior was based purely on racial assumptions." A Fox News reporter followed up, "Colonel, some people are saying this incident is being blown out of proportion. What's your response?" Jerome's expression hardened slightly. "Sir, if you think being subjected to racial slurs and threatened with arrest for operating a legitimate business is proportionate, then you're part of the problem we're trying to solve." The exchange created a viral moment that would be replayed on social media for weeks. Jerome's direct challenge to those who minimized racism resonated with audiences who had grown tired of discrimination being dismissed as misunderstandings or isolated incidents. Dr. Aaliyah Thompson, a reporter from Ebony magazine, asked, "Colonel Mitchell, what message do you have for other military families who've experienced similar treatment?" "My message is that you're not alone and your experiences matter. For too long, military families of color have been told to endure discrimination in silence. That ends now. We're creating systems to document, investigate, and address these incidents with the seriousness they deserve." After the press conference, Jerome returned to his office to find Sheriff Caleb Morrison waiting with Deputy Trevor Hayes and Officer Bradley Hutchins. Bradley looked haggard, his earlier arrogance replaced by genuine remorse. "Colonel Mitchell," Sheriff Morrison began, "Officer Hutchins asked to speak with you personally." Jerome studied Bradley's face, seeing something different from the day before. The racist swagger had been replaced by what appeared to be genuine shame and recognition of his mistakes. "Officer Hutchins, what did you want to say?" Bradley struggled to find words. "Sir, I've spent the last 24 hours thinking about what I did, and I realize it wasn't just about not recognizing your rank. I treated you with disrespect because of your race, and there's no excuse for that." "Go on." "I grew up in a family where racist attitudes were normal. I joined law enforcement thinking I was protecting people, but I realize I was actually part of the problem. I don't expect forgiveness, but I want you to know that I'm committed to changing." Jerome remained silent, allowing Bradley to continue. "Sir, I've requested enrollment in cultural sensitivity training, and I'm working with community organizations to understand the impact of my actions. I know it doesn't fix what I did, but I hope it prevents me from hurting anyone else." The sincerity in Bradley's voice was evident, but Jerome had heard too many hollow apologies from people caught in racist behavior to be easily swayed. "Officer Hutchins, personal growth is commendable, but it doesn't address the systemic issues that allowed your behavior to continue unchecked for years. How many other military families have you harassed? How many black citizens have you treated with similar disrespect?" Bradley's face flushed with shame. "Too many, sir, and I realize now that each one of those interactions caused real harm to real people." Sheriff Morrison intervened. "Colonel, Officer Hutchins has been suspended, pending a full investigation, but we want to work with you on the broader reforms you've proposed." "Sheriff, I appreciate that, but accountability has to come before reconciliation. Officer Hutchins needs to face consequences for his actions, and your department needs to demonstrate that discrimination won't be tolerated. Over the following weeks, the Braxton incident became a case study in how institutions could respond to discrimination with both justice and reform. Officer Bradley Hutchins was terminated from the Sheriff's Department after a thorough investigation revealed a pattern of racially biased policing. But rather than simply being fired and forgotten, he was required to participate in a comprehensive education program designed to address the root causes of his prejudice. The program, developed jointly by military and civilian experts, became a model for how institutions could address discrimination through both punishment and rehabilitation. Bradley's participation wasn't voluntary. It was a condition of avoiding federal civil rights charges. Meanwhile, Jerome worked with military and civilian leaders to implement sweeping changes in police-military relations. The Braxton model required local law enforcement agencies to undergo rigorous training on military culture, unconscious bias, and de-escalation techniques. Agencies that failed to meet standards would lose their contracts with military installations, a significant financial incentive for compliance. The most innovative aspect of the program was the Community Relations Council, a joint civilian-military body with authority to investigate complaints, recommend policy changes, and monitor compliance with anti-discrimination standards. For the first time, military families had an independent avenue for addressing police harassment. 3 months after the incident, Jerome received a letter from Private Connor Walsh's girlfriend, Simone Jackson, the young black woman who had been repeatedly stopped by local police. "Colonel Mitchell," she wrote, "I wanted you to know that I haven't been stopped once since the new protocols were implemented. But more than that, when I visit the base now, I feel welcomed by the community instead of viewed with suspicion. Thank you for standing up not just for yourself, but for all of us." Similar letters arrived daily from military families across the country as the Braxton model was implemented at installations nationwide. The program wasn't perfect, and implementation faced resistance from some law enforcement agencies and local politicians. But the high-profile nature of Jerome's case had created political pressure for meaningful change. The transformation wasn't limited to police relations. The incident had sparked broader conversations about discrimination within military communities, leading to enhanced equal opportunity programs and more aggressive enforcement of anti-discrimination policies. 6 months after the food truck confrontation, Jerome was invited to speak at the Pentagon's annual Equal Opportunity Conference. His presentation on leadership in the face of adversity drew standing ovations from military leaders representing every branch of service. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jerome concluded his remarks, "what happened to me at Fort Braxton wasn't unique. What was unique was having the platform and resources to demand accountability. Our obligation as leaders is to ensure that every service member and military family has access to that same level of protection and respect." The impact extended beyond military communities. Police departments across the country began implementing similar training programs for interactions with minority communities in general. The Braxton model's emphasis on accountability, transparency, and community oversight became a template for police reform efforts nationwide. But perhaps the most significant change was cultural. Jerome's dignified response to discrimination had demonstrated that strength didn't require aggression, and that true leadership meant transforming opposition into opportunity for positive change. The food truck, Sergeant's Kitchen, had become a symbol of perseverance and dignity. Jerome continued operating it several days per week, not because he needed the income, but because it represented his connection to the soldiers he served. The meals he prepared were seasoned not just with herbs and spices, but with respect and care for the people who defended America. 1 year after the incident, Fort Braxton hosted its first annual Community Unity Festival, bringing together military families and civilian residents for a celebration of diversity and mutual respect. The festival featured food from Sergeant's Kitchen alongside offerings from other local businesses, creating the kind of inclusive community environment that had seemed impossible before Jerome's confrontation with Officer Hutchins. Jerome walked through the festival grounds, watching children from military and civilian families play together while their parents shared meals and conversations. This was the real victory, not the media attention or policy changes, but the creation of a community where everyone could belong without fear of harassment or discrimination. "Colonel," came a familiar voice from behind him. Jerome turned to see Bradley Hutchins approaching, looking nervous but determined. "Officer Hutchins," Jerome replied neutrally, "I heard you'd found employment with a community organization." "Yes, sir. I'm working with the Regional Civil Rights Commission now, helping to investigate discrimination complaints and develop prevention programs. It's my way of trying to make amends for the harm I've caused." Jerome studied the man who had once threatened to arrest him for operating a legitimate business. The transformation appeared genuine, but actions would ultimately speak louder than words. "That's commendable, Bradley. Real change requires sustained effort, not just good intentions." "I understand that, sir, and I want you to know that your response to my behavior changed my life. You could have destroyed me, but instead, you created an opportunity for me to become a better person." Jerome nodded thoughtfully. "Everyone deserves a chance at redemption, Bradley. But earning it requires more than just apologizing. It requires dedicating yourself to making sure others don't experience what you put me through." "That's exactly what I'm trying to do, sir." As Bradley walked away, Jerome reflected on the complexity of human nature and the possibility of genuine transformation. The real test wouldn't be Bradley's words, but his actions over the coming years as he worked to repair the damage his prejudice had caused. The sun was setting over Fort Braxton, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples as families finished their meals and children played in the evening light. This was what America was supposed to look like: diverse, inclusive, and united by common values rather than divided by superficial differences. Jerome's phone buzzed with a text from his mother. "Saw the news coverage of your festival. So proud of what you've built from such an ugly beginning. That's the son I raised." Indeed, it was. The boy from the Detroit projects had become a man capable of transforming hatred into hope, discrimination into opportunity, and confrontation into community. The lesson of Fort Braxton would continue inspiring others to respond to adversity with dignity, strength, and an unwavering commitment to justice. Comment number 3. If you believe that real change comes from transforming systems, not just punishing individuals, don't forget to like and subscribe to see more stories about how ordinary moments can become catalysts for extraordinary change. 2 years after the incident that had transformed Fort Braxton and influenced military-civilian relations across the nation, Colonel Jerome Mitchell stood before the United States Senate Committee on Armed Services, delivering testimony that would cap one of the most remarkable journeys in modern military history. "Senators," Jerome began, his voice carrying the same calm authority that had faced down racism and transformed it into reform. "The Braxton model has now been implemented at over 300 military installations across the United States and its territories. The results speak to the power of accountability, transparency, and community engagement in addressing discrimination." Senator Austin Bradley, the committee chair, reviewed the statistics before him. "Colonel Mitchell, the data shows a 73% reduction in discrimination complaints at installations using your model. Can you explain what makes this approach so effective? Jerome leaned forward slightly, his expression serious. Senator, traditional approaches to discrimination focused on individual incidents rather than systemic causes. The Braxton model addresses root causes by creating accountability structures, mandatory training with real consequences, and community oversight with actual authority. Senator Madison Foster, the ranking minority member, interjected, "Colonel, critics argue that your approach is too heavy-handed, that it creates adversarial relationships between military and civilian communities. How do you respond?" Ma'am, with respect, discrimination creates adversarial relationships. Accountability creates trust. Military families who previously feared interaction with local law enforcement now feel protected and respected. That's not adversarial. That's what healthy civil-military relations should look like. Jerome's testimony was being broadcast live on C-SPAN and streamed online, reaching millions of viewers who had followed the story from its beginning at a food truck outside Fort Braxton. The transformation from local incident to national policy had been remarkable, but the real measure of success wasn't in headlines or hearings. It was in the daily experiences of military families who no longer feared harassment based on their race. After the hearing, Jerome returned to Fort Braxton, where preparations were underway for his change of command ceremony. After 27 years of military service, including 2 years leading the most successful anti-discrimination program in military history, Jerome was retiring to enter civilian life with the same dignity and purpose that had defined his career. The ceremony was scheduled for the following week, but tonight Jerome had a different engagement. He was working his final shift at Sergeant's Kitchen, serving meals to the soldiers who had supported him through the most challenging and rewarding period of his military career. "Colonel," said Staff Sergeant Malik Johnson as he accepted his usual order, "it won't be the same around here without you, but what you've built is going to last long after you're gone." Jerome smiled as he handed over the plate. "That's the point, Malik. Real leadership isn't about being indispensable. It's about creating systems and culture that continue improving long after you've moved on." As the evening wore on, soldiers from across the base came to share meals and memories with their departing commander. Many brought their families, including spouses and children who had benefited from the safer, more inclusive community environment that Jerome's leadership had created. Private Connor Walsh, now Sergeant Walsh, after rapid promotion, arrived with his fiancée Simone Jackson. The young couple represented the kind of positive change that had emerged from the initial crisis. "Colonel," Simone said, "I know we've never talked directly about what happened that day, but I want you to know that your response changed everything for military families like mine. My children will grow up in a world where their race doesn't determine how they're treated by people in authority." "That's the greatest compliment I could receive, Simone. Thank you." As the night continued, Jerome reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. The racist encounter with Officer Bradley Hutchins had been humiliating and infuriating, but his response had created ripple effects that extended far beyond anything he could have imagined. The policy changes were significant. Comprehensive anti-discrimination training, civilian military oversight committees, and financial consequences for agencies that failed to meet standards. But the cultural changes were even more important. Military families now felt empowered to report discrimination, knowing their complaints would be taken seriously and addressed effectively. The transformation hadn't been limited to Fort Braxton or even military communities. The Braxton model had been adapted by police departments, school districts, and corporations across the country. Jerome's demonstration that dignity and strategic thinking could accomplish more than anger and confrontation had influenced how institutions approached discrimination complaints. Dr. Simone Reynolds, the civilian expert who had helped develop the original program, arrived as Jerome was closing the food truck for the final time. "Colonel Mitchell," she said, "I wanted to personally thank you for your partnership in creating something that's changed countless lives." Dr. Reynolds, what do you see as the lasting impact of what we've built here? Beyond the immediate policy changes, I think we've demonstrated that discrimination can be addressed through both accountability and education. Your response to Officer Hutchins showed that transformation is possible when people are held responsible for their actions, but also given opportunities to learn and grow. Indeed, Bradley Hutchins had become an unlikely success story within the broader narrative. After losing his job with the Sheriff's Department, he had committed himself to understanding and addressing the prejudices that had shaped his worldview. His work with the Regional Civil Rights Commission had earned grudging respect from community leaders and former critics. Jerome had maintained occasional contact with Bradley, not out of friendship, but out of professional interest in whether genuine transformation was possible. The evidence suggested it was, though it required sustained effort and genuine commitment to change. "Colonel," Bradley had said during their most recent conversation, "I know I can never undo the harm I caused, but I hope my current work helps prevent others from making the same mistakes I did." Jerome had accepted the statement at face value while remaining vigilant about Bradley's future actions. Redemption was possible, but it had to be earned through consistent behavior over time, not just expressed through words. The retirement ceremony took place on a crisp autumn morning, with General Morrison presiding over the formal transfer of command to Colonel Preston Hayes, Jerome's carefully selected successor. The base parade ground was filled with soldiers, civilians, and dignitaries who had come to honor Jerome's service and the transformational leadership he had provided. "Ladies and gentlemen," General Morrison announced, "Colonel Jerome Mitchell has served this nation with extraordinary distinction for 27 years. But his greatest contribution may be demonstrating that true strength comes from responding to hatred with wisdom, discrimination with dignity, and confrontation with compassion." The ceremony included the traditional military protocols, but it was the personal testimonials that captured the real impact of Jerome's leadership. Soldiers shared stories of his mentorship. Families talked about the safer community he had created, and civilian leaders acknowledged the improved relations his programs had fostered. Master Sergeant Isaiah Reynolds, now the Senior Enlisted Advisor Emeritus, delivered remarks that summarized Jerome's legacy. "Colonel Mitchell taught us that leadership isn't about commanding obedience. It's about inspiring others to be better than they thought possible. He didn't just serve our country, he made our country better." After the ceremony, Jerome changed from his dress uniform into civilian clothes for the final time. The symbolism wasn't lost on him. He was returning to the civilian world that had once rejected and discriminated against him, but now as someone who had helped make that world more just and inclusive. His first stop was the Detroit neighborhood where he had grown up. The housing projects had been demolished and replaced with mixed-income housing, but the community center where Jerome's mother had brought him for after-school programs was still standing. Keisha Mitchell, now 78, but still sharp and proud, was waiting for him with several dozen community members who had gathered to welcome home their hometown hero. "Jerome," she said as she embraced her son, "you've made this old neighborhood proud, but more than that, you've shown everyone that where you come from doesn't determine where you can go." Jerome spoke to the gathered crowd about the importance of education, perseverance, and maintaining dignity in the face of adversity. But his most important message was about the responsibility that came with success. When life gives you opportunities, he told the young people present, remember that they come with an obligation to create opportunities for others. Success isn't just about what you achieve, it's about what you enable others to achieve. The community center named its new leadership program the Jerome Mitchell Academy, focusing on developing young leaders who could address social justice issues with the same combination of strategic thinking and moral clarity that had defined Jerome's career. Jerome's transition to civilian life included consulting work with organizations seeking to implement anti-discrimination programs similar to the Braxton model. His first major contract was with a Fortune 500 company that had faced multiple discrimination lawsuits and wanted to fundamentally change its corporate culture. But Jerome's most meaningful work was with the Jerome Mitchell Foundation, established to provide scholarships and mentorship for young people from disadvantaged backgrounds who demonstrated leadership potential. The Foundation's mission statement reflected the lessons learned from his military career, transforming challenge into opportunity, adversity into advantage, and discrimination into determination. The Foundation's first scholarship recipients included Connor Walsh's younger brother, who had been inspired by Jerome's example to pursue military service, and Bradley Hutchins's daughter, who had chosen to study civil rights law after witnessing her father's transformation. The inclusion of Bradley's daughter in the program had been controversial, with some critics arguing that the family didn't deserve such consideration. But Jerome had insisted that children shouldn't be penalized for their parents' mistakes, and that supporting her education was consistent with the Foundation's mission of transforming adversity into opportunity. 5 years after retiring from the military, Jerome was invited to return to Fort Braxton for the dedication of the Mitchell Community Relations Center, a facility that housed the joint civilian-military programs that had grown out of the original Braxton model. The ceremony took place on the same spot where Sergeant's kitchen had been parked on that fateful day when Officer Hutchins had made the mistake that changed everything. Jerome stood before a crowd that included current and former soldiers, civilian leaders, and family members whose lives had been improved by the programs that emerged from that confrontation. 5 years ago, Jerome began, this location was the site of a painful encounter with prejudice and discrimination. Today, it's the headquarters for programs that have eliminated such encounters from this community and inspired similar changes across our nation. The transformation was visible everywhere. The base's relationship with the surrounding civilian community had evolved from suspicious tolerance to genuine partnership. Military families felt welcomed rather than watched, and civilian residents had developed appreciation for the diversity and strength that military families brought to their community. The most powerful testimony came from unexpected sources. Sheriff Caleb Morrison, who had initially approached the incident as a public relations problem to be managed, had become a genuine advocate for police reform and community relations. Colonel Mitchell, the sheriff said during his remarks, you taught us that accountability and reform aren't punitive measures. They're opportunities for improvement. Our department is stronger, our community is safer, and our relationships are healthier because you refused to let discrimination go unchallenged. Even more remarkable was the presence of Bradley Hutchins, now serving as the state's Director of Police Community Relations, a position he had earned through 5 years of dedicated work addressing the problems his own prejudice had once exemplified. Colonel Mitchell, Bradley said, when it was his turn to speak, I can never repay the debt I owe to you and the community I harmed, but I hope my current work represents a down payment on that debt, and I'm committed to spending the rest of my career making sure no other officer makes the mistakes I made. Jerome's response was gracious but measured. Bradley's transformation demonstrates that people can change when they're held accountable for their actions and given opportunities to learn and grow. But the real test isn't what someone says they've learned. It's how consistently they apply those lessons over time. As the ceremony concluded, Jerome walked through the Community Relations Center, observing the programs that had grown out of his confrontation with discrimination. Young people from military and civilian families worked together on community service projects. Police officers and military personnel participated in joint training exercises. Families that had once viewed each other with suspicion now collaborated on everything from youth sports leagues to environmental cleanup projects. The Mitchell Center had become more than a building. It was a symbol of what was possible when confrontation was transformed into collaboration, when discrimination was met with determination, and when individual courage catalyzed systematic change. Jerome's phone buzzed with a text message from his mother. "Saw the ceremony on the news. Your father would be so proud. You took the worst thing that ever happened to you and turned it into the best thing that ever happened to your community." Indeed, that was perhaps the greatest lesson of the entire experience, that how you respond to adversity matters more than the adversity itself. Jerome's dignified reaction to racism had accomplished more than any angry confrontation could have achieved. His strategic thinking had created lasting change rather than momentary satisfaction. As evening fell over Fort Braxton, Jerome stood on the steps of the Community Relations Center, looking out over a military installation and civilian community that had been fundamentally transformed by the events that began with a racist police officer and a food truck. The legacy wasn't just in the policies that had been changed or the programs that had been implemented. It was in the children who would grow up in a more just world, the families who felt safe and welcomed in their communities, and the leaders who had learned that true strength comes from lifting others up rather than tearing them down. Jerome Mitchell had started as a boy from the projects who refused to be defined by his circumstances. He had become a military leader who refused to be diminished by discrimination, and ultimately he had become a transformational figure who had shown that individual dignity and strategic thinking could create systemic change that would benefit generations to come. The food truck was long gone, replaced by the Community Relations Center, but the lessons it had taught remained: that respect must be earned through character, that discrimination must be confronted with courage, and that true leadership transforms opposition into opportunity for positive change. As Jerome walked to his car, he passed the spot where Officer Bradley Hutchins had first approached him with racist assumptions and arrogant authority. Now that same location hosted weekly community dinners where military and civilian families shared meals and built relationships that transcended racial and cultural differences. The circle was complete. What had begun as an encounter with hatred had been transformed into a foundation for hope. The boy from Detroit who had faced discrimination throughout his military career had not only overcome those obstacles but had created systems to ensure that others wouldn't face similar challenges. Jerome's story was more than an individual triumph. It was a demonstration of the power that comes from responding to injustice, with strategic thinking, moral clarity, and unwavering commitment to making the world better for everyone. The last text message of the day came from Staff Sergeant Malik Johnson, now serving at Fort Campbell. "Colonel, just wanted to let you know that the Braxton model was implemented here last month. No incidents to report, and military families are saying they feel more welcomed than ever before. Your legacy lives on." Jerome smiled as he read the message. This was the real victory, not the headlines or ceremonies, but the quiet reality of military families living without fear of harassment, civilian communities embracing diversity, and young leaders learning that dignity and strategic thinking could accomplish more than anger and confrontation. The sun set over Texas as Jerome drove home, knowing that somewhere across America, military families were sleeping safely in communities that had learned to value their service and respect their humanity. Police officers were conducting their duties with enhanced awareness of unconscious bias and commitment to equal treatment. And young people from all backgrounds were learning that their circumstances didn't have to define their destinies. The transformation from food truck confrontation to national civil rights model had taken 5 years, but its impact would last for generations. Jerome Mitchell had proven that one person's dignified response to discrimination could create ripple effects that changed an entire nation's approach to justice and equality. As he pulled into his driveway, Jerome reflected on the journey that had brought him from that humiliating moment outside Fort Braxton's main gate to this evening of quiet satisfaction. He had faced the worst of human behavior and responded with the best of human character. He had been called boy by a racist cop and had responded by becoming a man who made boys of all races feel safer in their communities. The lesson was simple but profound. When confronted with hatred, respond with wisdom. When facing discrimination, fight back with dignity. When given the opportunity to tear someone down, choose instead to build something up that will benefit everyone. Jerome Mitchell's story had become America's story. Imperfect, sometimes painful, but ultimately hopeful because it demonstrated that progress is possible when individuals refuse to accept injustice and instead work systematically to create a more perfect union. The food truck may have been retired, but its legacy lived on in every community where the Braxton model had been implemented, in every police officer who had received enhanced training, in every military family that felt safe and welcome, and in every young person who had learned that their character mattered more than their circumstances. This was the true measure of leadership, not the applause received, but the lives improved long after the applause had faded. Jerome Mitchell had faced his moment of testing and had passed with the kind of grace, wisdom, and strategic thinking that transformed individual adversity into collective advancement. The story that began with racist assumptions and threatened arrest had concluded with systemic reform and transformed communities. It was a uniquely American story, messy, complicated, but ultimately hopeful because it proved that individuals still had the power to change systems, that dignity could overcome discrimination, and that arc of the moral universe, while long, could be bent toward justice through persistent strategic action. Comment below with your thoughts on how Jerome's approach compares to other responses to discrimination you've seen. Would you have handled the situation the same way? Or would you have chosen a different path? Don't forget to like this video if you believe that responding to hatred with wisdom creates more lasting change than responding with anger. Subscribe to our channel for more stories about real leadership, genuine transformation, and the power of character in the face of adversity. Remember, every moment of confrontation is an opportunity for transformation. Every encounter with injustice is a chance to create justice, and every experience with discrimination can become a catalyst for systemic change if we respond with the kind of strategic thinking, moral clarity, and unwavering dignity that Colonel Jerome Mitchell demonstrated on that hot Texas afternoon when a racist cop made the mistake of underestimating a man who had spent his entire life proving that character matters more than color, that dignity defeats discrimination, and that true strength comes from lifting others up rather than tearing them down.